before we start off today on the Afghanistan situation, I want to run through a bit of just American history and foreign policy and interventionalism, but we'll get to all of that. But first, the man who wants to be Trump's successor, not Ron DeSantis, but of course, Texas Governor Greg Abbott tests positive for COVID 19. This is not shocking to anybody. I know for the last few weeks we've been really going on a COVID 19 rampage. Figuratively on the show, and actually in the South. So this is just another not surprising turn for Texas and the governor, who is, of course, vaccinated, so he will be pretty much protected and won't see any long-term lung damage here, I'm sure. But this is the man who has been pushing against mask mandates and vaccines. Just a friendly reminder that all the people who keep telling you not to get vaccinated are vaccinated themselves and are just trying to push a narrative for political gain. But that aside, hello everybody and welcome back to the Chadvocate channel, where we break down daily news, politics, and policy, and I am your Chad host. So for today, what I want to discuss is foreign policy, and I'm sure everybody who's been paying attention to the news, even somewhat, has noticed the fall of Afghanistan and Kabul. So this is not very surprising to me, somebody who's studied political science and a bit of foreign policy and a bit of American history. That was actually my minor in college. So I wanted to do a deeper dive today on where America has really come from on these issues, a few foreign policy ideologies that seem to dictate what we do, and we flip-flop back and forth between the two. My prediction would be of where we're actually going to go from here. But the first thing I want to do is start off with just defining and asking, what is adventurism? If anybody has ever studied foreign policy at all, this term should be pretty familiar to you, and we will go on to define it. What is realism? At least from a foreign policy standpoint. If you're familiar with these, we're going to go on to define them. And what do they have to do with the downfall of Afghanistan to the Taliban? So let's get into the lessons that America cannot seem to grasp on foreign policy since before World War II. So adventurism. From a foreign policy standpoint, it's venturing into conflict for the benefit of one's nation in terms of land and resources. This stems from interventionalism, which is the policy or doctrine of intervening, especially in governments, which we love to do in America, in the affairs of another state or in domestic or economic affairs. So what I've done is set up a little bracket here for reference. So on one side, you can see we have adventurism and interventionalism. And on the other side, we have realism and isolationism. So for everybody in the chat or anybody watching, let's define realism and isolationism. Realism is a more reserved foreign policy for the purposes of reserving your resources, your blood and treasure, for when you're actually going to need them. So you can see this from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's position in World War II. Woodrow Wilson in World War I, he was more of an isolationist, kind of wanted to stay out of it. The doctrine of realism is do not waste your resources on fruitless endeavors. So these two brackets that we see here seem to be our two main focuses when it comes to interventionalism and foreign wars and foreign policy writ large. And we're mainly going to take a look at all of the wars stemming all the way back to the Mexican-American War. So stuff that we're not very familiar with. I had to read up on it and do a lot of research on these topics again to get more familiarized. I do realize, and I wanted just to get all the facts before I went into this big, long diatribe of adventurism versus realism. So the first thing that we have is the mid to late 19th century, which is the 1800s. The Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, Mexico refused to recognize the annexation of Texas. So this is what we were really fighting over in the Mexican-American War, trying to get some of California, New Mexico, parts of Utah, Arizona, and of course, Texas. So Mexico refused to cede to us the Texas territory, which obviously we did not like. And this is one of the first instances we can see of adventurism and interventionalism. So I'm counting this as a foreign war, even though today this is part of America. This was Mexico at the time. We invaded a foreign country. So the president at the time was James K. Polk. A lot of people don't really know him. He's just a footnote in history. He is one of the greatest proponents of manifest destiny. So manifest destiny is the doctrine and belief of the expansion of the U.S. throughout the American continents was both justified and inevitable. Exactly. I mean, nobody would. And hey, welcome back, Trin. But yeah, so I'm sure people have heard or familiar with manifest destiny broadly from their history classes in high school. He sent troops to the border, the disputed border, kind of antagonized, essentially throwing stones at the Mexicans until they fired back at Americans, which sparked exactly what he wanted: to adventure into Mexico, claim the territories, and intervene in Mexican politics. After the war, Mexico relinquished Texas claims. We also got parts of California, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. This sparked an even worse consequence than I even realized before I did my research. A lot of historians tie the direct consequence of this interventionalism to the start of the American Civil War. So the tie here was the slavery debate. You want to say hi, puppy? Come here. Oh, good boy. So the slavery debate was reignited over this acquisition of land. A lot of territories wanted to either be slave states or they wanted to be free states. Once this sparked that debate back up again in the Americas, it really was the catalyst to the beginning of the Civil War. Now, the Civil War obviously just stands alone. It's not an interventionist foreign war. It is, our only civil war and only war fought, aside from the Revolution, on American soil, and I guess the War of 1812. So this doesn't really fall into either camp of interventionalist or realist isolationist. This I will keep outside of our bracket for now, and we'll put this one squarely in the adventurism camp. So moving on from there, after the Civil War, into the late 19th century, late 1800s, was the Spanish-American War. This, again, is not a very well-known war throughout American history. Now, just the term intervene doesn't fall under the foreign political term of interventionalism. Interventionalism is to disrupt or get involved in someone else's country. Every war you're going to be inherently intervening. That doesn't necessarily make it interventionalism from a foreign policy ideological standpoint. It is you are intervening, but again, it's not a foreign intervention, which doesn't fall under the foreign policy definition. Moving on to the Spanish-American War. This one was a little complicated. Spain declared war on the U.S. April 1898 because the U.S. broadly supported the Cubans' struggle for independence from the Spanish colonizers. We kind of saw it as a brother-sister relationship to our own revolution in the late 1700s. So the public opinion was really supporting the Cubans in their independent struggle. President William McKinley wanted to be more hands-off. He was an isolationist kind of president, but the problem here was the Congress was not. In order to appease them, he sends the USS Maine, a warship, to Havana, Cuba. The warship was then bombed and sank by underwater mines. So to try to avoid going to war on behalf of the Cubans, which is a weird juxtaposition to how we treat Cuba now, oddly enough, he set up a court and a commission to try to determine what sank the USS Maine. Ultimately, it didn't matter. They found that it was an underwater mine, and he turned to Congress since he didn't want to be the one to pull the trigger. Back then, we actually stuck to what the Constitution said, that only Congress has the power to declare war. Thus, he turns to Congress, Congress being an adventurist and interventionalist body at that time, declares war. We go to war with Cuba to intervene in their politics. Yes, the good old days. Intervening, even though it was popular at the time, just like the war in Afghanistan, which we are going to get to, it was an interventionalist war. We interfered in the Cuban-Spanish Revolution. So now we're starting to get to the early 20th century, most known for the two world wars, both of which I'm arguing from a realist and isolationist standpoint. I don't really count the War of 1812 or Revolution falling into either of these camps. I guess you could claim they were realist and isolationist. Well, we just didn't really have an army at that time. We had the Continental Army. If it wasn't for France in the Napoleonic Wars of 1812, we probably would have been back to being a British colony. That's why British soldiers left the Americas in 1812 to go fight Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. So those are kind of a gray area. I would say solidly, this is the first time we see a move from old school manifest destiny, adventurist, interventionalist streak of America. And now we're going to flip over to the war weariness of realism and isolationism. Trenchfoot, yeah, always trenchfoot. That's the first thing. So after the first two world wars, the reason that we had the European Union and why something like Brexit was really heartbreaking for a lot of people in the United Kingdom is these two wars were based on fervent nationalism and those ties to pride in country that had wreaked havoc across Europe for centuries. And that's why I believe it was 2015 or so, the EU actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for actually keeping peace on the continent of Europe for the first time in 50 years at that point. It was a big deal. Almost throughout the entirety of human history, Europe was at war with itself in some fashion. So going back to World War I, that was fought between the Allied Entente powers, Russia, Britain, France, Japan, Italy, the United States, against the Central Powers, which was the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire's modern-day Turkey, German Empire, Austro-Hungarian, and Bulgaria. At this time, it was Woodrow Wilson in World War I. So he was a staunch isolationist. Wilson's efforts to negotiate a peace deal was rejected by both sides. So he wanted to be the intermediary of the peace deal between the conflicting powers without getting involved. As a consequence, and how we got dragged in the first place was because we reserved the right to trade with both sides, we said. We said we wanted to still trade with the UK, and we still wanted to trade with Germany. UK, at the time, set up a blockade to Germany. If the United Kingdom, and the US is all the way over here, is doing a blockade of Germany, we're not getting through. And we're not going to sacrifice the trade negotiations and trade deals and partnerships we have with the United Kingdom in order to appease Germany because they're being blockaded. Germany saw this not in the best light. So Germany starts to get more aggressive, and they start attacking merchant ships. They actually sank 3 American merchant vessels, and this all culminated really around RMS Lusitania, where 198 Americans died. So Wilson, at the time, still being a staunch isolationist, started the preparedness movement. Yes, they ramped up their submarine warfare. Correct. So this is what he started, the preparedness movement, which is why I view it as a realist standpoint. Because again, realism is saying we need to be prepared and we need to reserve our blood and treasure, our soldiers and our money for when we absolutely must go to war. So as Germany keeps encroaching on American merchant ships and infringing on our trade rights and killing American citizens, the fever starts to spike in the United States, where we need to move into the First World War. I found this insanely interesting when I read it. After intercepting German communications in which Germany sought to persuade Mexico into joining the Central Powers and attack the United States, then Wilson had no choice but to enter the Allied Entente powers and go to war with the Central Powers. I knew that we were pulled in mainly by the RMS, a British ship. I did not know that we intercepted German communications saying that, hey, Mexico, why don't you just start fucking with the United States? So we enter into World War I. That ends, and we entered it really late. It was a war of attrition. After Germany surrendered, finally, then we see the war reparations that were put in place by the United Kingdom and France. The U.S. actually rejected the Treaty of Versailles for World War I, and only France and the U.K. Were trying to implement those war reparations from Germany, led to World War II. We are still an isolationist country. So let's go back to our little chart here, where we have now flipped from adventurism and interventionalism to realism and isolationism. So FDR, he was an isolationist, realist. Actually, it was Franklin Roosevelt that rejected the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson was no longer in office. That was signed by Britain and France that I mentioned earlier. And I don't think we need to go too far into World War II. We were dragged into it by Pearl Harbor. Not to go too far ahead, but the difference between what happened in Pearl Harbor and what happened on 9/11 is we actually declared war on the people who attacked us and were allied against the people who attacked us. So Germany and the Empire of Japan. What we did in the war in Afghanistan was we went into Afghanistan. 14 of the 17 hijackers were Saudis. We ended up in not only one wrong country, in 2, Afghanistan, and later in 2003, Iraq, which was based on a lie. We'll can that for now. So World War II, after being attacked, we get dragged in. Allies win the war. So now we're getting into the late 20th century. Well, we had to lie first. Everybody knows the Iraq war was based on the WMD lie. Al-Qaeda is not the Taliban. We declared war on the Taliban because they were harboring Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden, who the person we wanted to go get, which we could have done with special forces, US intelligence, CIA, to get retribution from that terrorist actor. It would be like if just some guy in Japan planned a terrorist attack and then bombed Pearl Harbor. We went over to Japan, fucking off that guy, and then we stayed the hell out of World War II. If there's like some sleeper cell in Japan, not a perfect parallel. It wasn't the government of Afghanistan that did this to us. It wasn't the government of Iraq that attacked us. It was a terrorist organization that could have been taken out through special forces and intelligence assets. We completely overshot the mark with George W. Bush. And to complete his task of a hegemonic sphere of influence in the region, he wanted to get Saddam Hussein out of there so we could build that democracy and sphere of influence in our image, which never works. So now we're going to get into recent wars and more the ones that have parallels. So we have the Korean War, forgotten war really, where we have Harry Truman meets with a Russian diplomat who had really good relations with Franklin Roosevelt. He basically had short man syndrome, for lack of a better term. He wanted to put his dick on the table with this Russian diplomat, essentially told him to fuck off, we don't want to talk to you anymore, after they just spent hundreds of millions of dollars and millions of lives lost in the Second World War. I mean, it was really the USSR that won the Second World War. I think it was upwards of 15 to 20 million people on the Russian side that died in World War II, where our casualties were, I think, 3 to 400,000. So just to put things into perspective, Truman was like, yeah, I really showed that bastard. So this was the establishment of what is known as the Truman Doctrine. So this established that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under the threat of external or internal authoritarian forces, really setting the stage to flip back to interventionalism. So in the Korean War, in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and the U.S., with the United Nations, that was brand new at the time, sought to intervene in this war. This one's a bit of a gray area. It established the Truman Doctrine, which was interventionalist by nature, but also we had a UN coalition behind us. I'm still going to put it in column B right now, because it was really the pretext to what came later, which was the Vietnam War, the containment policy that we saw, and a lot of parallels have been drawn between the evacuation of Saigon to the evacuation of Afghanistan right now, which we'll take a look at shortly. So we're going to put the Korean War over here. So the Vietnam War is really where we start to see multi-term wars that are lasting well beyond just 1 to 4 years of somebody's time in office. So the Vietnam War actually started under Eisenhower, then JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and Gerald Ford. So after years of, brutal war, numerous war crimes going into Laos and Cambodia, we essentially gave up. And the only difference I really see between the evacuation of Saigon and the evacuation we're seeing right now in Afghanistan is that the one in Afghanistan is arguably worse. Because at least the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong that did come down and take over the capital, they aren't selling 15-year-old girls in the streets right now. It's a comparison optically, but when you take a look at each one of the fighting forces, the Taliban is extremely fucking shitty, to put it lightly. Without question, this is another adventurist interventionalism policy and war of containment established by the Truman Doctrine. So this is what everybody has been comparing right now, and I'll show the video.
Walked to the back of the embassy. We had to push and shove our way through a crowd of several hundred Vietnamese trying to scale the walls, only to be knocked back by U.S. Once inside the compound, for the Americans and those Vietnamese who managed to get in with legal documents, and the many who managed entrance without, the rest was easy. It was just a matter of waiting your turn for a helicopter to take you to one of the ships on station off the Vietnamese coast. The American fleet had been having problems since the start of the evacuation, with the arrival of South Vietnamese pilots and their helicopters loaded with family and friends. Hovering above the decks to unload their passengers, the pilots were unfamiliar with landing their craft on a moving ship. One crashed into the side of the USS Blue Ridge. Others managed to crash land on the deck of the ship. For those that did manage to put down, they were simply pushed over the side and into the sea by U.S. sailors and Marines to make room for the returning American craft based on that ship, filled with evacuees from Saigon. Other South Vietnamese pilots just hovered long enough to unload their passengers and then headed to the side of the ships and just jumped out with their life vests to be picked up by U.S. sailors. Their helicopters crashing into the sea. Still other pilots headed out to the side of the ships after unloading their...
The evacuation of Saigon was a nightmare. This was back in 1975. Now compare that to what we're seeing today.
U.S. military aircrafts as they try to take off. The U.S. is in charge of the airport there, but their focus is on the evacuation of American personnel. As far as commercial flights go, it's a disorderly mess with little security, and the commercial flights are currently not running. We know that as of last night, the U.S. military had flown around 500 embassy personnel out of the country on military aircraft. They're working
we've seen people jumping out of the landing gears, trying to get inside the fuselage, people falling off the planes, clinging to the side. It's a nightmare. It's very reminiscent of Saigon in 1975. But I think a lot of people would agree that a long overdue war, where we intervened, where we probably should never have been, had to end. It was inevitable. If we stayed there for another 5 years, another 20 years, another month, it wasn't going to matter. We should have left probably in Obama's first term. The comparison between the fall of Mosul in Iraq to what we're seeing here again. Because the Taliban took over Kabul, and the Afghan army that we spent all of this money, all of this time, all of these American lives trying to secure and train was all for nothing. And the only reason that this isn't really being compared as closely to the fall of Mosul in Iraq is because it took a little bit more time for Mosul to fall to ISIS. The Taliban is already an established regime, they're already an established group, whereas ISIS was trying to bring about a new caliphate to the region, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So they were trying to go cross borders and build up that coalition to start moving towards a new caliphate in the region. So we pull out of Iraq in 2011, and then by 2014, the fall of Mosul, which is almost identical to what we're seeing in Kabul, Afghanistan.
Another major piece of what America fought for in Iraq was lost today. Islamic militants seized control of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city with 1.5 million people. The group had already taken the cities of Fallujah and Ramadi in the west. U.S. forces spent nearly a decade fighting for control of those cities before withdrawing 2.5 years ago. In Mosul today, we saw sporadic gunfire and burning military vehicles. The insurgents seized police stations, banks, and government buildings. Many Iraqi soldiers dropped their weapons and vanished.
It's almost identical to what's going on in Afghanistan. Again, the only difference is ISIS took a little bit longer to establish a presence and have the capability to take over Mosul. I guess the only real parallel is the speed at which Saigon fell and the speed at which Kabul fell. But as far as brutality, as far as wasting the money to arm the Iraqi government to try to put in place a U.S.-friendly government, it's identical because they were wars that we were fighting side by side at the same time. And historians have said that Afghanistan is a place where empires go to die, and we still went in 2001 anyway. So then we have the Gulf War, which 1990-1991. It's more on par with the Korean War. It is interventionalist, but it's more in the middle. It's a coalition-based force that went in together for a specific task, which I would argue is what we should have done in Iraq and Afghanistan, if not going it alone without a coalition of the willing, just with intelligence and special forces to hold those responsible for 9/11 accountable. That's not what we did. So the Gulf War from 1990 to 1991, it's more of like a neo-adventurism, where we're venturing into these wars not only for the sole benefit of our nation, but we're trying to now bring democracy to the region. And this is where America World Police starts to stem from, and the eventual Iraq War, which we were just discussing. So now, heading into the Iraq War, we see the establishment of the Bush Doctrine, which is very similar to the Truman Doctrine, but it just takes it a step further now. The Bush Doctrine affirms the legitimacy of a preventing strike and emphasizes the notion that if you are not with us, you are against us. U.S. foreign policy, therefore, is no longer just about containment or supporting freedom fighters, but is about shedding the multilateralism in favor of a unilateralism, just one, us going it alone. So if the people that we were allies with in the Gulf War do not want to go with us, we are seeing them not as enemies, but they're really not with us anymore. It's a go-it-alone policy. We're going to bring democracy to this region, whether you like it or not. Now, the Iraq War, as we all know, spanned the Obama administration as well. And I was not happy at the time when he decided to do the troop surge in 2009. He ran on an anti-war platform in 2008, but was talked into by what people call the blob. So the blob is the military-industrial complex that will convince you that we need to stay in these wars basically forever. So as a new president in 2008 takes office, is under the impression that a surge to win over hearts and minds of the region could work. We sent over 100,000 troops from 2008 up to 2010, 12, until we eventually draw down forces entirely. It didn't work. It was a fruitless policy. It was a waste of money and time and American lives, and is a blemish on Obama's record. Again, once we saw the drawdown in 2011, after we had finally took out Osama bin Laden. So that was one of the precursors to getting out of Iraq. If you remember, doesn't make any sense because we weren't in Iraq because of 9/11. We were in Iraq because they had weapons of mass destruction. Once we assassinated Osama bin Laden, rightfully, who was in Pakistan, in neither of the countries we invaded. We decided to pull out of Iraq, but not Afghanistan. It was still us fighting against the Taliban, and Obama just didn't really have the balls to pull out. The war continues in Afghanistan through George Bush, through Barack Obama, and of course, Donald Trump, who had the most erratic foreign policy when it came to war. The first thing he does is he drops what's called the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, which is the largest non-nuclear bomb ever used in war. You know, he wanted to nuke hurricanes, for fuck's sake. He was a moron. I think this was an appeasement on the military's part.
Green light.
Dude, that thing's the size of the fucking plane.
Wait, Roger.
So this is what, 2003 footage? This is just a test. This wasn't even the actual bombing, but yeah, the largest ordnance outside of a nuclear bomb. It's hard to tell from here. Anything that is even on the same scale is comparable to a little bit less than a nuke. I think that's pretty fucking bad. I guess he thought that this would solve the problem. At least he took the conservative rhetoric of, we're gonna make the sand glow and all that fucking horse shit. It had the effect that we all knew was gonna happen. It didn't do anything. As he keeps going in his foreign policy, he has the bright idea, as we're fighting the war in Afghanistan, to pull forces out of Syria and then move them to Iraq. Why would he do that? Well, because he's friends with this guy, Tayyip Erdogan. How Erdogan made Turkey authoritarian again. And the reason Trump really liked this guy is because what Erdogan did in Turkey was take a democracy, a constitutionalist democracy, and he became its figurehead and its authoritarian leader. So he really loved the guy, and the Kurds who were fighting alongside us against ISIS had a problem with the Turkish government. Turkey did not like the Kurds, but they were our allies. So after a phone call with Tayyip Erdogan, he just pulled our troops out and moved them to Iraq. So you can't even say that what he was doing was trying to draw down the war in the region. He was trying to be, an isolationist as he claimed. But no, he just moved the troops over to another dangerous situation. And he went out and he touted, I'm ending the wars. At least Biden had the fucking balls to pull out. And I give him a lot of credit for that. It's ending in disaster, but no matter who was going to have to eat this shit sandwich, it was going to end in fucking disaster. And at least he didn't want to push this off to another presidency. So here we are finally with the evacuation of Kabul. So now what do we do? My prescription for the region would be we need to start working with our allies here, and we need to evacuate just about every Afghan that wants out. We put them in this situation. We need to bring them out of that situation to the United States if they so choose to. Work with allies so they are not under the Taliban regime that has just taken over the country. And we need to expedite that process for people who work with the US government, the contractors who work there, the interpreters who worked with us. They all need to be refugees in the United States, if not in allied countries. We need to get a coalition to accept these people from the region. We need to wind down the drone war in the Middle East. If we're going to pull out and we're going to try to stop that propaganda that they can continuously feed to people to join the Taliban and other radical Islamic organizations, we're going to need to stop murdering people from the fucking skies. We're going to need to start rolling that back. We should try to continue the peace talks with the Taliban. The main problem with the original peace talks under the Trump administration was he was doing a classic America First bullshit negotiation, meaning he left the Afghan government out of the negotiations. So it was the U.S. directly talking to the Taliban without the Afghan government in on that negotiation. Makes no fucking sense. We need to repeal the authorization of military use of force. That is a dying piece of legislation where we gave President Bush a gun and a badge and said fucking yeehaw, do whatever you want in the Middle East. That is an antiquated bill that should not be upheld or reinstated or revoted on like it is every single year. We need to start allocating funds away from old warfare. We need to start drawing down our military-industrial complex that has been suckling on the teat of the American taxpayer for the past 20 years in these endless wars. We need to allocate funding towards cyber warfare, and that isn't just rusting tanks in the middle of the desert in New Mexico. There's no reason for us to keep doing this. It's a waste of money. It's essentially a socialist works program that doesn't produce anything that we need. It's just a fucking jobs program. And I guess finally, we need to learn our lesson. Even my parents were saying, I thought we learned this lesson from Vietnam years ago. And we're going to see a lot of saber rattling again from people like Dan Crenshaw saying that, me and my buddies, we liked going out there and killing bad guys, and we were there. Like, people say we didn't win anything in Afghanistan. We won no more 9/11s for the last 20 years. It's like, well, that's a real specious claim. I don't know. And I'm pretty positive since 2001, the major problem of terrorism in the United States has been domestic white supremacist terrorist organizations. They are comparable, if not surpassing, the attack on 9/11. So the real threat, the killer's inside the house, essentially, at this point. We need to focus back on American domestic policy. We need some fucking housekeeping. I don't know how long this clip is, but let's take a look at what Ben Shapiro has to say, and let's see him weasel his way out. Because before we even start this, I pulled up a clip from Trump, June 26th. So after Biden announces that he wants to leave Afghanistan, our boy's going to try to take credit for that.
People are being shot by the thousands every year. Worse than Afghanistan. How about that? Worse than Afghanistan, where, by the way, I started the process. All the troops are coming back home. They couldn't stop the process. 21 years is enough, don't we think? 21 years. They couldn't stop the process.
He was so strong and so powerful that even just his proposition before he left office was, it was already happening. Biden couldn't stop it even if he wanted to. So let's see how Trump is handling that right now, how the GOP is handling that. The RNC deleted a webpage hailing Trump's Taliban deal as fighters swept Afghanistan, but it just says it's part of routine web maintenance, and this is Business Insider. So here was the GOP website a few days ago. President Trump has continued to take the lead in peace talks as he signed a historic peace deal agreement with the Taliban in Afghanistan, which would end America's longest war, touting that as an accomplishment. And just the other day, 404 error. Looks like you're as lost as Biden. Now, this isn't just Trump's website. This is the Republican National Committee. This is their website, just doing a little fuck the libs jab. It's so fucking childish. Keep that in mind for whatever Ben Shapiro is about to say here.
Obviously, the big news of the day and of the year, and frankly of the last 20 years, is the Taliban is now in charge of Afghanistan again because Joe Biden decided it would be a wonderful, wonderful idea to simply leave.
Trump had the wonderful idea to simply leave, like we just fucking said.
With no plan, with no actual transition, with no support for the people who are still there. And so what we have on our hands is a full-scale disaster area. Now remember, it was just 1 month ago that Joe Biden was saying that don't worry, it's not going to be like Saigon. It's not going to be like the United States leaving Vietnam with helicopters taking off from roofs and the Viet Cong simply rushing in and killing everybody they don't like. It's not going to be anything like that. It'll be,
like I said before, that did not happen in Saigon. They did not rush in and kill everybody that they don't like. Juxtapose what is going on in Afghanistan right now, where they actually are, killing people in the fucking streets if you had anything to do with the American government. There has been talk on the inside, and there's been reporting. Essentially, it's been an intelligence failure. It does fall at the feet of Joe Biden. A few months ago, he said, you're not going to see the fall of Kabul. They're not going to take over so quickly, because I think he was actually being given information by his intelligence agency that was not possible. Yeah, he fucked up there by speaking out of turn and jumping the gun. What else was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to say, yeah, I'm going to pull out and, it's going to be fucking hellfire in Afghanistan?
orderly. After all, there's a big Afghan army, and we've been arming them and supporting them. Here was Joe Biden saying what is now, in retrospect, the dumbest thing he possibly could have said 1 month ago.
Do you see any parallels between this withdrawal and what happened in Vietnam with some people feeling...
None whatsoever. Zero. What you had entire brigades breaking through the gates of our embassy. 6, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, this isn't great.
The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
This dunderheaded fool, this unbelievable coward, all of that was a lie. That was a lie. And it was perfectly...
Okay, calm down, Ben.
Obviously, it was a lie at the time.
Dunderheaded fool. It was an absolute lie. The outrage. Then why didn't your guy Trump pull out? Why was he such a bitch? And also, what would you have done differently? We can agree on problems, but we also need to agree on solutions, remedies, prescriptions to a problem. So he's very good at getting people to agree with a problem. And that's what he probably does the best. Yes, this does suck. But what would have been and what is the remedy? So he can do this long screed about how dunderheaded Joe Biden is. And it doesn't really matter unless he has some policy position or idea of how he could have prevented it. What do you think was going to be different if you did implement those policies? Now, it's just going to be a what-if game, but I would like to see some prescriptions from Ben.
Here's the thing. They're still lying in real time. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he was asked on Sunday whether this was like Saigon. And here is what he had to say.
President Biden said that under no circumstance, and that was his word, those were his words, under no circumstance were the U.S. personnel, embassy personnel, be airlifted out of Kabul in a replay of the scenes that we saw in Saigon in 1975. So isn't that exactly what we're seeing now? I mean, even the images are evocative of what happened in Vietnam.
Let's take a step back. This is manifestly not Saigon. The fact of the matter is this. We went to Afghanistan 20 years ago with one mission in mind, and that was to deal with the people who attacked us on 9/11. And that mission has been successful.
Okay, this is insane. It's exactly like Saigon. By the way, it's not like Saigon. Let me just show you a picture of Saigon and a picture of what happened the other day. These are side by side. Okay, so on your left-hand side, you'll see Saigon. You have people attempting to escape.
Again, it's just it's the speed at which it's worse. It's worse than Saigon.
Taliban fighters placing their guns on the desks, sitting behind the desk.
Now, the Taliban here, when they took over the presidential palace, and then they all just kind of like stood around and didn't really know what to do after that. It seems like that's exactly what would have happened if the insurrectionists on January 6th actually took over the capital. They're kind of just standing there looking around like, okay, what now?
We assume that is the desk of the Afghan president. A fairly stunning turnaround of events in Kabul.
Okay, remember, last week, the Biden administration said it would be somewhere between 30 and 90 days before the Taliban even had the capacity to take over Kabul. It took about 30 to 90 hours for them to actually do it. 30 to 90 hours.
CNN's Kylie Atwood now reporting the American.
Yeah, I mean, it sucks, Ben. It fucking blows. I don't know what else to say. It's the speed at which they took over Kabul. That is a problem, and it is a bad thing that happened. But what do you want to do now?
American flag at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul.
So they just ended up with a bunch of your taxpayer dollars in their hands in the form of actual weaponry. According to the New York Times, Taliban fighters poured into the Afghan capital on Sunday amid scenes of panic and chaos, bringing a swift and shocking close to the Afghan government and the 20-year American era in the country. President Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan fled the country. A council of Afghan officials, including former President Hamid Karzai, said they would open negotiations with the Taliban over the shape of the insurgency's takeover. By day's end, the insurgents had all but officially sealed their...
Yeah, but the Afghan government wasn't in on the negotiations to begin with, Ben. So now, once they've taken over the Afghan government and the government buildings, and the president has now fled, Ashraf Ghani has now left, what power do they hold in the negotiations? They have none. So when he was negotiating with the Taliban, not including the Afghans, this was just setting it up for disaster to begin with. It's a classic Trump move where he was preemptively taking credit for something that he thought was going to be good, that he thought that the public was going to see as, a really good transition, which 70% still think that we should have left. Yes, and it's optically terrible. We need to get the refugees out of there. We didn't expect it to fall as fast as it did. But again, most people still think that this was a good idea. We are tired of war. We are flipping back to, I hope, more of a realist, isolationist foreign policy when it comes to war.
Control of the entire country. Hastily arranged American military helicopter flights evacuating the sprawling American embassy compound in Kabul, ferrying American diplomats and the Afghan embassy workers to the Kabul military airport. At the civilian airport next door, Afghans wept as they begged airline workers to put their families on outbound commercial flights, even as most were grounded in favor of military aircraft that were repaired.
He's just going to keep running the optics into the ground here. By all means, Ben, if you want to be the guy to say that, no, we should have stayed, I will cede that ground to you, sir. Go right ahead. You can walk off that fucking cliff. Even Trump was smart enough to fucking about face and shut the fuck up about it. So yeah, I don't need to hear the rest of Ben Shapiro's screed because I don't think he's going to have a real coherent policy position at the end. I don't think he's going to have a remedy, an alternative future that he would have seen when his last guy was pulling out of northern Syria and just moving him to Iraq. I don't think he really believes in anything. He's a classic grifter just trying to divide the country. Well, all right, everyone, that's probably going to do it for me today. If you're joining in, if you liked, please give me a follow. On Twitter, it's Chad_Vocate. On YouTube, it is Chadvocate. If you do like the channel on Twitch, please give us a follow and hop in the chat. That would be fantastic. And have a great night.